So welcome to this UCLC's Russian Cinema Research Group seminar. My name is Rachel Morley and I'm Associate Professor of Russian Cinema and Culture here at UCLC's and co-chair of the Russian Cinema Research Group. I'm really happy to welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Anna Toropova. Anna is a Wellcome Trust Research Fellow at the University of Nottingham. Her current project focuses on cinema and medicine in early Soviet Russia, exploring the intersection of medical knowledge, cinematic technology, and revolutionary agendas of mind-body transformation in Soviet Russia, roughly between the period 1917 to 1936. Prior to taking up her current position at Nottingham, Anna held a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Cambridge. She's also an alumna of UCLC's, and she completed her PhD thesis here in 2011. Anna has published numerous articles on Soviet cinema, biopolitics, medicine, and spectatorship in Slavic Review, the Russian Review, the Journal of Contemporary History, studies in Russian and Soviet cinema, and other journals. Today, though, she's going to talk to us about her monograph, Feeling Revolution, Cinema, Genre, and the Politics of Affect under Stalin. This was published by Oxford University Press in 2020 as part of their series, Emotions in History. The book examines film as a technology of emotional and affective education during the Stalin era. It's the first book-length examination of Stalin-era film genre and their function as tools of emotional and political education. So Anna, welcome back to SSEES and over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the lovely introduction, for organising the event. It's an absolute pleasure to join you this evening. The research group, was such an important resource to me throughout the process of writing this book, and it's lovely to be able to join you to talk about the end result. So I'll start with a quotation. So let me figure out. Yeah. I'll start with a quotation that expresses the view, which was very common during the period, that the Stalin era had generated new structures of feeling, right? The things that our grandfathers laughed at no longer seem funny to us. The things that our grandmothers cried at no longer elicit our tears. We are different from the people who lived 30 years before us. Our feelings are different. And in the book, I attempt to take this claim seriously in a sense and to think about, what it would mean to laugh or to cry in a Soviet way. And I look at the role of cinema in helping to shape this new emotional landscape. It's striking that the shift to a socialist realist cinema in the 1930s is framed by cultural producers and industry bosses as a shift to a more viewer-friendly, emotionally engaging form of cinema. Right, this accusation that montage experiments had alienated Soviet audiences by solely targeting their reason had grown deafening by the 1930s. And the socialist realist turn in cinema is conceptualized as Soviet filmmakers finally finding a new emotionally resonant way to speak to audiences. Right, if the old cinema was, to use the language of the film press, devoid of passion, ice cold, akin to a mathematical formula, the new cinema moved, excited, and stirred the viewer. It spoke at full volume, it pulled at the heartstrings, and it grabbed the viewer by the throat. So in the book, I look at the development of Soviet cinema's genre repertoire as a key part of Soviet cinema's emotional turn. The distinctive urgency and directness with which genre films appealed to audience emotions had long fascinated Soviet theorists, artists, filmmakers from Lev Kuleshov to Anatoly Lunacharsky. And whenever socialist realism is discussed as a new emotional style and method of Soviet cinema in the early 30s, this question of film genre and its development really comes to the fore. Right? Cultural authorities were very vocal that socialist realist cinema demanded the cultivation of, I quote, the most diverse genres and forms. Boris Shumyatsky, the head of the Stalin era of the film industry in the 30s, famously launches this battle for new film genres that could mobilize cheerful and life-affirming emotions. And he frames this task as the film industry's obligation to its viewer. So in the book, I situate this push to create a more emotionally resonant genre cinema within broader scientific debates about emotion and aesthetic reception. And this is what I'll be talking about in my talk today. And I'll be focusing in particular on the reevaluation of emotional life that we can see taking place in Stalin era psychology. Okay, so in the early and mid 1920s, Ivan Pavlov's and Vladimir Byaktirov's works on reflex response to stimuli had pushed the study of human behavior to take a new objective and materialist direction. And during this time, we see the dominance of theories that really emphasize the organic roots of human emotion. The most widely accepted region of emotion at this time was that put forward by the American psychologist William James, and the Danish physiologist Carl Lange. And this is a theory that roots emotion in the visceral changes of the body. Right? James famously contended that the physiological reactions that are usually assumed to be the result of emotional states were in fact their cause, right? So we don't cry because we're sad, but because of tears, sobbing, a decreased heart rate, pains in the stomach, and so on. And the dominance of the James-Lange theory reflected the quite limited space that was permitted to questions of consciousness in Pavlov's studies of higher nervous activity and Byaktirov's reflexology. Right? Even the word emotion was seen by some scientists at the time as a kind of remnant of introspectionism and subjective psychology. By the early 1930s, however, these theories that situated the origins of emotional states and bodily changes really begin to lose their hold. Right? In the late 1920s, we see the establishment of psychology's independence as a discipline from physiology, and the beginning of attempts to redress the failure of some earlier mechanistic accounts of human behavior to actually consider the problem of consciousness. And there's a whole host of psychologists, including Alexander Luria, Alexei Leontiev, Lev Vygotsky, who make the case for the emotional sphere's intertwinement with the cognitive processes of the mind. And they also really stress the close connection between emotions and the social environment. And the James-Lange theory now comes to be heavily criticized for enacting this chasm between the emotions and the intellect. Alexander Luria, for example, criticizes it for transferring the whole domain of affect to pure physiology. Then later on in the Stalin period, right, we see attempts to place the field of psychology on a firmer Marxist basis. And this manifests in increasing attention to the plasticity and the sociocultural development of the human mind. And this gradually closes the door to any understanding of emotions as kind of hardwired, unchanging biological phenomena. Right? Emotions, Stalin-era psychologists like Sergei Rubinstein and Pavel Jakobson stressed were conditioned by the social relations and the ideas that were operative in a given stage of historical development. And with this cultural historical understanding of emotion, the possibility of cultivating and shaping effective life really comes to the fore. Right? A number of psychologists and educators look towards the sphere of culture as this privileged site of emotional socialization and transformation. Cinema, which is frequently referred to as a medium endowed with really unparalleled capacity for psychological influence due to its status as this multi-sensory art form, is seen to have a particularly important role to play. So Abraham Gilmont, for example, is one psychologist who emphasizes the really unique power of film in making the viewer experience socialist feelings. Feelings of collectiveness, comradeships, friendship, feelings of joy and awe, a sense of the comic, the beautiful and the ugly, feelings of sympathy and empathy. Lazar Sukhorybsky, who is both a doctor and a film scholar, even likens Soviet cinema's powers and emotional influence to a kind of prophylactic for the mind, right? He describes it as a form of preventative inoculation against the leftovers of the old rotten and corrupt order, right? Precisely because of its capacity to cultivate new feelings. Okay, and I think it's not incidental that both Abraham Gilmont and Sukhorybsky were actually involved in film viewer research in the 1920s. I think the inquiry into film reception is another branch of research that my book looks at as an important factor in how cinema starts to be conceptualized as a technology of emotional and psychological influence. Like from the 1920s, from around the mid-1920s, we see the launch of inquiries into the impact of films on viewers in a range of institutions using a variety of scientific methods. And as I point out, these studies are often driven by the attempt to grapple with the question of emotional engagement. So the first step towards a better understanding of the emotional dynamics of film viewing is taken by the mass questionnaires into audience attitudes that are conducted at research centres like the Society for the Friends of Soviet Cinema. And these enquêtes, albeit quite in a rudimentary way, first begin to probe the viewer's state of mind and impressions after the screening. So here's the questionnaire on Eisenstein's film October, which asked the viewer to specify whether they found the film engaging, moving, or boring. And this question of emotional engagement is also broached by film audience observations, where researchers mapped the variety and intensity of viewers' emotions during screening. So they count bouts of laughter, for example, tears and yawns, and contrast these against specific points of narrative development. These observations then typically result in these graphs or psychodiagrams that illustrate the fluctuation of audience emotions over the course of the film. This is the diagram here for Battleship Potemkin. And photography is often used in these observations as well. There's an example featured on this slide. And towards the end of the 20s, we also had studies of individual viewers' emotional reactions in a laboratory setting. There's a number of institutes that acquire specialist equipment to gauge the fluctuation of the viewers' levels of emotional arousal by the recording of facial expression and the measurement of alterations in breathing rate and pulse, skin conductance, motor control. So the investigation of emotional response is set as one of the main agendas of the film laboratory at the Scientific Research Institute for Pedagogical Methodology, which begins to study cinema's impact on children in 1926. This is under the leadership of Abraham Gilmont. At the beginning of the 1930s, the Institute expands these investigations to adult film viewers as part of their larger study of mass culture's techniques of emotional influence. And I should note that Soviet directors are often themselves involved in the study of viewers' emotions. So in 1928, Sergei Eisenstein is appointed to head the film section at the Laboratory for the Study of Mass Behavior and Mass Psychotechnics. This is at the Polytechnical Museum in Moscow. And this laboratory was already studying emotional reflex responses to other forms of mass culture, including theatre performances and mass lectures, and the film section was to expand this research. And one of Eisenstein's ideas was to film viewers' facial expressions in close-up during screenings and to use William James's theories of emotional expression to decode the footage. And as Anna Lenina has shown, this research primarily understood emotion as a physiological phenomenon, right? Researchers tended to directly translate all these quantitative alterations in breathing rate and pulse and so on into emotional changes. But in the 1930s, we see research into cinema's emotional impact take a psychological turn, and this reflects, the broader shift within Soviet psychology that I've already talked about. So studies that reduce emotional reactions to their bodily manifestations begin to fall out of favor, and researchers turn to qualitative methods like in-depth interviews and small group observation. And they reconceptualize their the whole object of their research is the study of film perception, kinemospriyatia, which is understood as the inquiry into how a film's form and style impacts the processes of its interpretation by the viewer. So the psychologist Piotr Rudek first begins the study of kinemospriyatia at the Institute of Psychology, Pathology and Psychotechnics in the early 30s. Later, his work moves to GIK, the State Institute of Cinematography, where he works alongside another psychologist, Olga Nikiforova, to closely study the audience reception of a series of recent Soviet films. And the question of emotional effectiveness and engagement is really central to these studies. So Rijika Nikiforova stressed that an emotional component is at play in every aspect of the film perception process. They argue, in fact, that the intellectual and the emotional are completely intertwined in film viewing. So the entire process of film interpretation and comprehension is shown to be an emotional one in this work. What's also striking is that research into kinovосприятие kind of invariably tends to highlight the importance of narrative coherence, recognizable plot lines, and clear genre markers in assisting audience comprehension and emotional engagement. So one of Nikiforova's central theses is that recognizable narrative structures and clear indications as to the type of film that the viewer was watching, were vital to securing the viewer's full immersion into the film, right? The second stage of film perception, she describes it. And the earlier viewer studies of the 1920s had already pointed to the importance of genre to a cinema industry that was striving for maximal viewer engagement. Right? Questionnaires on audience preferences had made clear the differentiated nature of the Soviet audience, right? Young people, older people, urban residents, peasants, women, men, blue-collar workers versus educated professionals were all found to be groups with these distinct needs and preferences and tastes, preferences for different types of films. And Soviet cinema was typically found not to be doing enough to accommodate this variety of tastes. Questionnaire participants frequently contrasted the level of choice that was offered by foreign cinema to the homogeneity of the Soviet film repertoire. So, and these audience complaints about однообразие and seriousness, right, uniformity and grayness of the repertoire and offer start to be published in the film press at the end of the 20s. And they become part, I think, of this larger charge of emotional coldness that's levied against Soviet cinema during the Cultural Revolution. So this question of emotional appeal becomes intertwined with the question of genre. So these are some of the developments that I think are really key to understanding how the issue of emotional mobilization emerged as this really key question for Soviet cinema in the 1930s. And in the book, I also propose that the distinct understanding of emotion that's elaborated by the Stalin era scientific and cultural community has some important repercussions for the way in which the film industry then approaches and deals with questions of audience impact and emotional effectiveness. So one consequence is that emotional forms in the Stalin era become charged with social significance to the extent that debates, over ways of feeling essentially become debates about ways of being Soviet. The project of emotional education, which Soviet filmmakers are entrusted with, generates a huge amount of anxiety. Right? And this is quite understandable, since Soviet cinema's task of cultivating new feelings is elevated to a matter of key political importance, right? It's even described as a means of actually strengthening the Soviet Union's defensive arsenal against counter-revolutionary forces. Right, so the emotional responses that are targeted by Stalin films, become objects of very intense scrutiny. Filmmakers are expected to hone their representational strategies to the so-called noble emotions of the Stalin era. And also the widespread understanding that the emotional values of a specific historical era were reflected in its genre categories also led to efforts to retune many existing genres to new, distinctively Stalinist emotional settings. So in the book, I look at, for example, at the very tense discussions involving writers, directors, and cultural bosses over the question of how best to rework the genre of Soviet comedies so that it would give rise to a specifically Soviet form of laughter, which was conceptualized as a more mindful and socially orientated form of laughter than the idle chuckle targeted by American slapstick comedy. This is a still from the 1941 comedy Hearts of Four, which had a particularly difficult history. When the film was first discussed by the Artistic Council at Mosfilm, concerns were raised that the film sought to make the viewer laugh by placing its characters, and particularly its star, Valentina Sierova, into a series of humiliating situations. And the film was withheld from release in 1941 for ridiculing Soviet people, but it was released immediately after the war to accommodate the post-war demand for light entertainment. So this question about what was appropriate for Soviet people to laugh about, and in particular whether the comic mode was permissible in the genre of Soviet comedy, it remains really kind of unresolved and much discussed for much of the Stalin period. And alongside debates about Soviet laughter, I look in the book at discussions of tragic pathos and nerve-wracking suspense, and discussions of all these questions that are held at the Party Central Committee and the Artistic Councils of film studios and the Ministry of Cinematography, are really permeated by anxieties about triggering the wrong form of emotional response. So critics worried, for example, that rather than rousing righteous feelings of hatred for the enemy, the suspenseful strategies that were deployed in Soviet detectives made viewers liable to empathize with the villain. So Engineer Kochin's Mistake, this 1939 film, was one film that attracted this criticism. They were concerned that the tears provoked by the Soviet melodrama were expressions of a sense of powerlessness and tragic inevitability rather than a revolutionary desire to fight injustice. And they doubted whether the model of Stalinist happiness that was articulated in heroic biographies and production films, right, was the joy of labor and sacrifice and not the satisfaction of the well-fed, which was also described at the time as an American model of happiness. So to give you a sense of the way in which emotional response was discussed in the Stalin period, I want to briefly look at the discussion around a film that was made at the end of the war, but which subsequently fell victim to the repressions of the post-war period. And this is Grigory Kozintsev and Leonid Trauberg's wartime melodrama, Simple People, Простые люди. This film was ultimately banned in 1946 for falsifying wartime reality. And it stages the evacuation of an aeroplane factory to Uzbekistan. And it interweaves the focus on the daily struggles of wartime workers with this quite classic melodrama of a husband, the factory director Yeryomin, who's separated from his sick wife who has lost her memory. And the film builds pathos by continuously delaying the moment in which husband and wife are finally reunited, also in quite classical melodramatic style. It really emphasizes the victim's perspective, right? As theorists like Augustin Zarzosa have noted, melodrama is distinguished by this desire to render suffering visible. And we certainly see this in Simple People, right? Alongside the traumatized factory director's wife, who's plagued by flashbacks of her torture by the Nazis. The film presents a very long list of people whose lives have been ripped apart by the war. You have Stakhanovite's wife who gives birth to their son to be told that her husband has died at the front, a homeless child who's witnessed his family being murdered. These are all the simple people of the film's titles whose suffering struggle are at the very heart of the film. So I'll attempt to show you a clip from this film now. No idea if it will work, but we'll try it to give you a sense. Okay, can you see that? Okay, let's see.
В эшелоне была. Только я из Одессы, а она не знаю откуда. Очень несчастная женщина. От немцев, кажется, вырвал.
So here we have the factory director's wife, Yeremina, and we'll see the flashbacks of the torture.
Я счастливая.
Почему счастливая?
Ей-богу, счастливая. У меня же дети при себе. Дом наш в Одессе, конечно, разбомбило. Ну, нас вывезли, посадили на пароход. Пароход, конечно, потопило. А я и дети остались живые.
Значит, медных труб только не хватает.
Как вы сказали?
Огонь и воду прошли, медных труб только не хватает.
Да, медных труб не хватает. Может быть, яблок? Конечно, скушайте яблок. Товарищ от души предлагает. Спасибо. Не съел. И вы не думаете, что вам плохо. Вы думаете, что вам будет хорошо. Вот, конечно, мы найдем угол. Мне один адрес дал. Такой добрый. Да, все люди хорошие. Вот товарищи тоже помогли. Все люди хорошие. Будет хорошо. Все люди хорошие. Я сказала, дети, спокойно. Они нам ничего не сделают. Они ничего не сделали. Только дошли до минного поля и сказали, идите. И мы пошли. Я сказала, дети, идите осторожнее. Они шли осторожно, только плакали. И все равно был взрыв. И другой. И я ничего не помню. Наверное, меня убил. А мне не дают лежать. Хорошие люди. Будет хорошо. Не вам.
Okay. So when the film was discussed by the Artistic Council at the Ministry of Cinematography and at Len Film at the end of 1945, many members testified to the intensity of the film's emotional impact. So the writer, Konstantin Simonov, was one member who confided that the film had left him sobbing in his seat. The film's directors, Kozintsev and Traubach, were very pleased to hear that this film had this effect, and they said quite explicitly that their whole aim in the film, was to make a film that would stir the viewer's emotions as much as possible. But whilst the intense emotional response to the film invited was heralded as a very important achievement during discussions, it was at the same time framed as something that required careful management and which kind of risked overstepping certain limits, or the bounds of good taste, as one critic called it. And even before the film was discussed by the councils, a Ministry of Cinematography commission had raised concerns that aspects of the film's plot were too melodramatic and the parts of the film were excessively gloomy. Right? The film was not to become a kind of catalogue of horrors, it was warned. And in the discussion that ensued, many members of the council, even those who were very supportive of the film overall, still engaged in identifying specific scenes and aspects of the film that they felt veered into melodrama, which was this kind of code word for emotional too muchness, right? And I wanted to reference this discussion today because I think it's quite indicative of a Stalin era distrust and discomfort with excesses of emotionality. In the late 1940s, right, we see other films that were unflinching in their portrayal of wartime tragedy, like Sergei Gerasimov's 1948 adaptation of Alexander Fadeyev's novel The Young Guard, right? They were similarly criticized for encouraging the viewer to wallow in an abyss of suffering, grief, and tears. And really throughout the Stalin period, films that belonged to affect-defined genres in particular, right? So comedies, thrillers, melodramas tended to attract more critical scrutiny. Affective reactions that seized the entire body were often dismissed as thoughtless, mechanical, and empty, and associated with the traditions of Western cinema. Right? Industry bosses cautions that socialist realism was an art of real feeling, but not a hysterical art. And in light of the tendency of some contemporary affect theory to characterize affect as an intensity of visceral sensation that's not reducible to the field of meaning or representation, it might be tempting to read the alarm over heightened emotional states in Stalin era discussions as an anxiety over the push of the body. This reading, however, I think neglects crucial aspects of the Stalin era discourse on emotion. So psychologists actually repeatedly stressed that emotional education was not to be understood as a process in which primitive bodily affects were conquered by the mind. Right? This model of emotional extinction was actually criticized for positing a division between affect and intellect. And emotions co-entanglement with cognition became this kind of unshakable bedrock of psychological and cultural discussions of affects. It was only this co-entanglement, so psychologists argued, that could account for the artist's capacity to shape the consciousness of the Soviet person. So I think while much of our own contemporary turn to affect has thought to highlight the irreducibility of the visceral to cognition, to signification and meaning, I think the region of emotion that became entrenched in the Stalin era, by contrast, conceptualizing all forms of affect, even the most intense and disorganized, as historically determined forms of behavior that retain some connection to the cognitive processes of the mind. It was thereby, I think, not thoughtless and value-free frivolity that Soviet cultural bosses saw in a viewer's surrender to the experience of tragic pathos, nerve-wracking suspense, or side-splitting laughter for its own sake, right? But rather a class-hostile mode of social behavior, right? The body in the throes of emotional excess, I think, was a body engaged in un-Soviet social practices. And the discussions that forms of emotional response to conclude, the discussions that forms of emotional response ignited in the Stalin era, I think, reveal that they were inextricably part of a much broader battle over the meaning of Sovietness. So when Simple People, for example, was discussed by the councils, alongside those who criticized its melodramatic tendencies were those who very forcefully insisted that melodrama, had every right to its existence. Mikhail Rom, for example, asserted that, cutting out the plot line of the husband searching for his wife would not only ruin the entire film, but deprive the Soviet viewer of the chance to have a good cry, as he referred to it. And it's striking that the viewers who described their emotional responses to Soviet films in letters were often also compelled to insist that their intense reactions, were legitimate. Right? No, this is not an outpouring of sentimentality or despair, one young viewer wrote in reference to the tears that the young guard had compelled him to shed, but a show of sympathy for the nightmarish horrors that the people of Krasnodon were subjected to. Right? So, letting the viewer have a good cry, as Rom describes it, was not without ideological consequences. To shed tears at the representation of wartime tragedy, for example, right after the official emphasis had shifted onto the healing of wounded souls, as Anna Krylova has argued, was a socially meaningful act that pushed to expand the Stalinist configuration of Sovietness. So I think looking more closely at the way that emotion was understood in Soviet psychology, for example, allows us to see that it was actually emotion's investment with meaning in the Stalin era that rendered the process of its education to be both ideologically vital, but also ever vulnerable to derailment. And I'll finish on that today. Thank you.